The introduction to this piece is perhaps one of the most abused sections of this piece in terms of rhythm and interpretation. In short, what happens is that we hear one of our favorite players perform this piece on a recording or in a concert, and we're inspired to play the piece. Understandably, it's a wonderful piece. What we have heard is an interpretation from what has been written by the composer. And if we take our interpretation from that interpretation, we start getting a very distorted version of what the piece is actually, how it was actually written. So it's very important to go back, especially in the learning phase, and play exactly what's written on the score. So let's start out by mapping out exactly what's going on in this introduction. The very first harmonics that open the piece are striking and dramatic, and they are played at the 7th fret. I say that because often people might play it at the 12th fret. Harmonics and their notation can be confusing at the best of times, so let me just make it very clear. The 3 harmonics are played at the 7th fret, on the 5th, why would I say 5th? On the 4th, 5th, and 6th strings. These notes are held for 3 beats. The reason I say that is because often people will play and then they leave an indeterminate amount of time, either too short or too long. You know, it doesn't bear any relation to what's about to follow afterwards. So what I would suggest is to count like a conductor would before you start. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, E and When you count, and I'm not saying that you should count out loud in a performance, but for practice purposes it's good, and then also in a performance you might count in your head or gesture in your hand just for yourself. It also sets the tempo for the 16th notes that are about to arrive afterwards. The temptation with the 16th notes is to rush. There are slurs which have a technical tendency to rush towards the second note of each pair. And also, I think we've heard a lot of virtuosic renditions of this piece, so we're tempted to think this has to be fast. But if we're counting 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and then we have 16th notes at that tempo. And when you're learning this piece, I suggest you do play them in time and you play them at a moderate tempo that isn't virtuosic or rushing. We can get to that later, and we can have some rubato and freedom later, but I think in the early stages it's very important to play this with a rhythmic stability. So, from the top, 1, 2, 3 E and 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 1. Following on rhythmically, we have a half note. This is 2 beats, 1, 2. And then on the 3rd beat of that measure, 3 E and 1. These are also widely distorted. So firstly, this comes on the downbeat, 1, 2, 3. So I would suggest practicing that just to start off with. 1, 2, 3. Let's put that in context. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. We can place the 16th note in a little bit, but it's important to have that measure in time as well. So that you don't misplace this dotted rhythm that's about to come up, I would suggest you keep subdividing those 16th notes. Now, subdividing is simply breaking the beat into smaller parts, and we just had 16th notes to help us. So we can go 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 1. If you subdivide using those 16ths, then you can go 3 E and 1. It's a powerful rhythm, the dotted rhythm, and if you throw away the crispness of it, then it loses its effect. Dum, dum, da. If we just do this, we'd have, I mean, it sounds nice unto itself, but it doesn't actually have any rhythmic effect to it, which we do want in this piece. It has kind of a presence and maybe a nobility to it. Okay, so we suddenly get a completely different character just by staying true to the rhythm. Following that dotted rhythm, we have another half note, 1, 2, followed by a rest. So I would urge you to play that rest. That doesn't mean just let it ring, 1, 2, 3, it's just ringing, whatever. I actually mean stop the strings from sounding. So 1, 2, rest, and put your hand on the strings with your right hand, or you can do it with your left as well. You can also just put it lightly. What I would suggest you don't do is to make a sound, a percussive sound when you make that rest. This is a tendency of many guitarists to sort of play 1, 2, and you actually get a percussive sound by hitting the guitar to stop the strings. Just make it very gentle. Use a fleshy part, the side of your thumb, or the fleshy part under the third finger, and it can be quite subtle and rhythmic at the same time. So all in context, 1, 2, 3, E and 1, E and 2, E and 3, 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 1 and 2, rest. And then it repeats. And you want to do that in time as well. Like I said earlier, you do, and I do encourage you to explore the expressive rubato aspect of this passage. Later on it is an introduction, but I think playing it in that structured, rhythmically structured manner will help inform your interpretation later on. Speaking of interpretation, the repeat is an identical repeat in terms of material, but I don't think we should repeat it the same way the second time around. It's actually a gift to you as a performer to show your creativity to what you can bring to the performance. So there is no right or wrong answer here, but there are good ways and better ways to change up your interpretation. So let's take the opening harmonics the second time around. So you could have a rolled chord. Now guitarists often roll chords, sometimes habitually, but I consider a rolled chord as actually a little ornament of sorts. So we could roll it like that, You could play it with the flesh of your thumb to have a different sound. Or you could play it very softly. The first time might be quite dramatic. Ooh, too much perhaps. And then the second time. Following that, you might match that same mood that you set with the harmonics with a very different approach to the passage. Not so much with bravura and audacity, but rather muted. It still is quite virtuosic in terms of what we're doing, but we're controlling it, and it's almost an echo of what just came beforehand. Of course, you can mix in other elements like ponticello, tasto, free stroke, rest stroke, all these kind of articulations and variations are up to you. And that's why I say it is a wonderful gift for you as a interpreter to make what you will of this repeated material. So we've finished our first 4 measures with a repeat. Following on there, we have yet another measure that is often misunderstood in terms of rhythm. So measure 5, 1, 2, and 3, and 1, and 2. Okay? So I would highly recommend you play that while counting. 1, 2, and 3, and 1, and 2, 3. Maybe end there on the C sharp, so that you can get that passage really in time. Often what happens is you'll hear interpretation, and it's just a random set of rhythms. So I think the first long note gives a certain stature and a solidity to that passage, so I would recommend keeping that rhythm. Bum, 2, and 3, and 1, and 2. Okay? Following on from that, we have 2 sextuplets and then a fast group of 8 32nd notes, or semi-demiquavers for those playing in Australia and the UK. So we also want to practice those in time as well. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 6. Tika taka tum. So we've got, they all have to fit into one beat. So we've gone 1, 2, 3. Not sure if I did that. I would recommend trying to vocalize it correctly first. It's going to be easier and it'll help you get it in your head before you move on and try and put it in your fingers. I think I messed up a note there, but you can hear the general idea. And of course, I think this passage is probably intended to be played with some freedom and acceleration towards the final note. So once you have the rhythm, you can then perhaps smooth out the edges of those sextuplets and just make it one fluid line. But if you don't start with that rhythmic basis, I don't think there's anything to build upon. It's all just going to be a little bit disorganized. Finally, the B flat has a fermata over it, which means to hold it. One thing I would say about that is that tone-wise, the A following it, I would listen to the arc of decay from the B flat and try not to go, maybe follow that arc. So you can lead into with a nice smooth, almost a decrescendo of sorts into the next grinding introduction. So that's a rhythmic breakdown of the introduction. In terms of practicing the virtuosic passages, of which there are many in this piece, we have these 16th notes. I would highly recommend practicing this in chunks, and also not always practicing from the beginning of the passage. It's very tempting to always go from that high G, but it will serve you very well to practice from places like this and do small chunks that practice a shift. It will help secure your placement as you go along. Talking about placement, to plot some geographic points is going to be very helpful. So for instance, we start on the G, then we might find our next sort of fixed point, which would be the D with the second finger, and then the B flat, also with the second finger. So just having a solid knowledge, that is our locations we're going to shift to. And then in those positions we have the other notes, but they're in the position, so it's not as much of a challenge all of a sudden. So that would be our first practice chunk, to make sure we get the shift smoothly and accurately, just to the D, and then to the B flat, and then the rest of the passage there. So we've got 3 clear chunks we could practice. We could also practice in rhythmic groupings. So we could go 4, and then 4, and 4. And then of course we could practice larger groups. So let's say we do the first 2 beats, or perhaps the second 2 beats. All of this kind of practice will give us security to your left hand, which will then allow you to be very free and fluent in the actual passage itself. Start slow, but don't always practice it slow. I don't think in this kind of playing, very slow practice like it's helpful in terms of making sure your hand's doing the right thing and you're hitting the right notes, but you do have to practice this in tempo. So instead of putting this all slow, I would recommend making it a few notes, so maybe just 3 notes, but in time. Maybe then adding a note. If you've seen in the level 4 technical work, I believe we talk about chaining, and this is a fantastic opportunity to practice chaining. That kind of adding 1 note at a time. Okay, so that is how I would recommend practicing those 16th notes, and that actually goes for the other passages as well that come up later on. It's the same type of material, so you can practice it the same way. The fast sextuplets that do come up, I would similarly practice arriving at certain points. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1. What makes this a bit more difficult if you use this fingering is that you have a shift in there. And there can be some squeaks. These are brand new strings, but you can get away with most of it by just lifting up and then shifting. You don't have to do a massive squeak. And again, that kind of practice. And then practice just the 8 notes. So you can see how we're practicing in chunk, chunk, and then maybe we'll string it all together. Like that. So that's how I would approach those two tricky passages in terms of practice. Finally, I want to talk about fingering for this passage. I think there are a number of ways for many of these passages that you could finger it, but I want to point out a couple of ideas that might be helpful. So the first one that I want to bring up is in measure 3. We have this. Now obviously it's very tempting on the dotted rhythm, the very last note of that measure, to play an open E. And you can do that, of course. I actually like to change it up the first time I play it, sometimes I play it closed, because it really keeps the integrity of the melodic line. And the second time I will play it open because it allows me to play a different, completely different way. I roll the chord and I use it to sound a bit more ethereal. But I would definitely watch out for the tone difference. If you've come from this, that note there on the second string, and then suddenly play an open first string, it's very likely you'll get a thinner sound. So I would recommend getting your hand and your right hand, and when you play that top string, if you're going to use it, really turn your hand lengthwise so that you can try and imitate the second string sound. Oops. With the first string open. Here's what it sounds like on the second string. It's very thick. So that's probably the closest I can get on the first string, but it's much better than this. Yeah? I think if we are not careful, those open E's can get very spiky and disturb the melodic line. So I would encourage you to experiment with different fingerings there for different effects, especially with a repeat. On the cello-like line that we get at measure 5, I like to go way up the 4th string there and put a lot of vibrato on the E. So I've got my second finger there on the E, and I'm keeping my hand nice and loose so I can have a wide, relaxed vibrato. And I do keep all of that on that sextuplet on the same string, and I just have to live with that squeak. There are other ways to finger it, so maybe you don't have a shift in there, but I like the E so much that I really want to keep it all on that one string. It helps, for me, sound like the line is all coherent and homogeneous, and it sounds like a cello to me. That's what I hear in it. And then when it comes to the 8 notes, which are quite fast, I employ a lot of slurs. So a slur there, I think a slur from the B flat to the A, and then from the F to the A. So they facilitate a fast passage, but they also make it more of a flowing passage as opposed to that kind of, which is a bit more machine gun-esque, which I don't think particularly suits the passage. You want it more to be silky as opposed to rigid and divided. So that's the first 8 measures. We spent quite a bit of time on 8 measures, but they're very important. They open the piece, they set the scene, and I will say that those measures are the most abused and misconstrued measures of the whole piece whenever I've seen this performed. And I do think it's largely because of the fact that people have listened to other interpretations and then they base their interpretation on an interpretation, then it becomes a little bit of a Frankenstein, Frankenstein's monster. Anyway, let's get on to the next section.